Stalin's USSR. We've just learned about Hitler last week, and now we're going to go ahead and look at Stalin, kind of one side of the coin, maybe another side of the coin. But as you can see, Stalin, this is going to kind of come from World War One, just as Hitler kind of rose from the ashes of World War One. So, kind of to close things up, you have Lenin. He dies of a stroke and a hemorrhage. And so, 1924, Stalin takes his place. They use Marx as kind of their ideology. And as Marx had predicted, the state would eventually wither away as powers were given to the people, meaning that the more power that was given to the people, the less the state would be able to kind of maneuver around and kind of work through things. And the part of the reason for that is because they assumed it might end up by being something of the sort of like capitalism. More power people have, the less maybe they want the state or need the state. So we end up with Stalin taking the communist state and making it a totalitarian rule. Like, so he has all the power and increases the power of the state. And so he ends up by holding this power for, I don't know, somewhere around 30 years. The government made all basic economic decisions. So you can see there are pros, and then I'll tell you exactly what the cons are. So obviously you have high production goals, increased factories, hydropower. So they can basically go ahead and, as you can see all these things here, they can go ahead and say, hey, we're going to do this, whether it necessarily needs to be done or not, but it's going to be done because it's the best. Or we think it's the best, or, you know, whatever that might be. So they end up by going ahead and doing that. Now, it does isolate mostly from the world economy. USSR avoids world depression in 1930. So that's a huge positive because they're not entwined there. Now, the problem here is the low wages, strikes are forbidden. It's inefficient. And what I mean by inefficient, you can see there's surplus. But when you don't have a market telling you that hey, quit producing this, or hey, that's not really worth it, you end up with the things that you don't need, and the things you need, you don't have. So that, again, is a huge problem. One story that was told was during the time that Russia, or the USSR, I should say, was in this period, they had people who went through and produced shoes. So when they produced shoes, they would go ahead and pick the person who could do the cheapest. Now, those shoes were supposed to last an entire year, but in order to win the bid, people would make those shoes last for 6 months or 4 months. So people would all get these shoes. Great, we got a brand new pair of shoes. Oh, crud, these shoes stink. Yes, it's cheaper for the shoes, for the government, and the government did give us these shoes, but it sucks for us because we're sitting here with shoes that are just trash. So then you have the Lenin approach, where he gave farmers small plots. Stalin's response was, that is too inefficient. So the solution was to get those farms together, kind of what they did earlier in history. And then what ends up by happening is the farms are given better seed and machinery by the government, thinking, hey, you know, if we get these things together, we'll go through that. Well, what they did was the farmers resisted. They destroyed the tools, killed livestock, and burned the fields in protest, because you couldn't protest in certain other ways. Now, the government's response was to collect all the grain and starve the peasants, which I guess that's what you do, but that doesn't sound like it's going to end well for anybody. There's 5 to 8 million dead in starvation in Ukraine alone. Now, we can't necessarily look at all of these figures because they're going to be hidden, kind of like what China has done with the whole COVID thing, as they hid their figures. So he has the Great Purge. He's obsessed with fear of political rivals and those who might become that. He attacked the Bolsheviks, army heroes. Again, army heroes could be somebody who could speak out against him, or people look at them as idols. He wants to be the only idol. Industrial managers, people who maybe try to tell him to do things differently. Writers and ordinary citizens. Many were tortured. Now, the problem with this being tortured, it says, oh, well, they, in a trial, they were found guilty, or they confessed to being guilty. Well, the problem is when you get tortured, a lot of times people will just say something to get him off their back, or whoever's torturing him off their back, and you actually get the wrong kind of admittance. So they round up a ton of people, send them to Gulag, which are labor camps. It's like um, very notorious prison in Russia, or kind of the way it works. And then the good was he consolidated power for himself, and only those young and that owe everything to him would be underneath him. Of course, the bad is you kill a lot of the military leaders, and those people are going to be needed for World War II. And then he kills a lot of experts in the industry and economic and engineering. And so the big problem there is you need economic and engineering people to kind of get your stuff going. And so he killed them all. That sounds dumb. So he used propaganda to make himself look like a god, again, so people worship him instead of other things, or worship, well, their gods or whatever else they might want to look at for positive or light. He uses radio, movie, schools to spread the greatness of Stalin, communism, and the evils of capitalism. In doing this, it's going to create kind of this idea that he is the man, he is the one in charge. And so it just creates this negative and kind of if power vacuum if he ever leaves. So you get socialist realism. Stalin made artists and writers portray Soviet life in a positive light. That way, when anybody else saw it, they would think, man, this is a great thing. Why the heck wouldn't everybody want it? So Stalin promotes Russia communist culture. That's schools, languages, customs, tradition. He promotes atheisms, replaces religion with communism as its ideology. So you have sacred texts, which are going to be Marx and anybody else who's talked about communism in a positive light. And Lenin, of course, the guy who started it. So there's a shrine for Lenin, and then religious images are replaced with Stalin's picture because he wants, again, people to worship him. So you got pros, and of course, there's always going to be pros with everything. You have free education, so this includes universities. You have free Medicare or medical care, inexpensive housing, free public recreation, and equality for women. Those are great. Matter of fact, I think most people would say we should have those. Now, the cons, most lack the basic needs. So that's food, proper living conditions. Social elites often got special treatment, but on the con for that, pro for the social elite, there was a threat of another Stalin purge where they could be ousted or killed or tortured or whatever it would be. So Comintern is Communist International. The goal of this thing that they had was to get communism around the world to end capitalism. And the effect was the Western world was extremely suspicious of the USSR. That's a Soviet Union, what we call them. So the USSR wants to join the alliance with allies to stop Hitler's aggression. They don't like Hitler. They feel Hitler's encroaching, and Hitler doesn't necessarily like them. So why the heck would they want to? But they are like, whoa, you can't just join us. You're like trying to destroy us in all these other ways. We're not going to allow it. So Stalin basically has to make a non-aggression pact with Germany. Of course, that's going to end up by being broken in World War II. So we end here. There's going to be a quiz, and then you guys will see. I want to know what you think about the difference between Hitler and Stalin. And in doing so, you'll answer some questions, and then we'll kind of work from there. So I hope this finds you well, and you have a great rest of your week.